Today we welcome the historic decision to provide a new direct pathway to citizenship for New Zealanders who are living in Australia. It is the biggest improvement in the rights of New Zealanders living in Australia in a generation. It restores the rights that Kiwis had in Australia before they were revoked in 2001. Successive New Zealand so it's pleasing that the close relation minded governments has helped us to reach this outcome. Today's announcement underscores the strength and the breadth of the bonds between our countries ahead of my visit to Australia this afternoon and tomorrow. It will make a real and meaningful difference in the lives of New Zealanders and their children who are living in Australia by giving them similar rights to those that Australians living in New Zealand get. They'll still retain their New Zealand citizenship. These dual citizens aren't lost to us, but they are drawn closer together. The new pathway will apply to Kiwis on temporary, special category visas who have arrived since 2001 and lived in Australia for 4 years. They meet the standard criteria for citizenship, including character checks and an intention to reside there. Children born in Australia since the 1st of July 2022 to a New Zealand parent living there will automatically be entitled to citizenship, and that'll make critical services available to them. This is a personal issue for many Kiwis. Most of us know someone who's moved across the Tasman. They work hard, they pay their taxes, and they deserve a fair go. These changes deliver on the commitment made by Prime Minister Albanese on taking office to reverse the erosions that have taken place over 20 years, and I want to acknowledge his leadership in delivering on those commitments, and I thank him for that. He said that no New Zealander should be left permanently temporary in Australia, and I believe that he has delivered on that commitment. Tomorrow I'll be officially celebrating the new policy alongside Prime Minister Albanese at a citizenship ceremony in Brisbane, followed by a community barbecue. We'll also be visiting a cemetery in Brisbane to attend the unveiling of plaques for previously unmarked graves of soldiers who served during 2 world wars. A fitting way for us to mark Anzac connections just ahead of Anzac Day. Happy to open up for questions.
Prime Minister, why has this taken so long to get over the line, and what does that say about the state of our relationship over the last few years?
I think it shows that our relationship's in very good heart at the moment. This was a commitment that the incoming Australian government made in their early dialogue between our two countries. It's something that they've delivered on, I think, in relatively quick time since taking office less than a year ago. And so I absolutely want to acknowledge and thank them for the work that they have done to bring this to fruition. It's something that New Zealand governments have argued for a long period of time. And I really want to acknowledge the current Australian government for delivering on it.
On the flip side of that, how worried are you that New Zealanders will say, oh, that looks pretty good across there now, and go and make their life in the lucky country?
New Zealanders travel and live in Australia regardless of whether this change was made or not. I don't think that this will significantly change the calculation that New Zealanders will make when it comes to making decisions about whether to migrate to Australia, but it will mean that if they do make that decision, and people make that for a whole wide variety of different reasons, including family connections. I don't think it will make a significant difference to that calculation. Now, there is no way to model that. I don't believe it will be the deciding factor in whether or not people choose to go to Australia.
Is that just instinctive, or what you're saying?
As I've indicated, there is no way to model that. But there are already around 700,000 New Zealanders living in Australia now. About over 500,000 of those were born in New Zealand. We don't know exactly how many of them will be affected by this policy change, because of course it will depend on when they arrived in Australia, but it is likely that a significant number of those are going to benefit from this.
Do you agree that since 2001 New Zealanders living in Australia have been treated as second-class citizens, and is this about fairness today?
I think Prime Minister Albanese's comment that New Zealanders living in Australia have been treated as permanently temporary, and that was unfair, unjust and unsustainable. I think he was absolutely right in that regard. It wasn't fair. New Zealanders are some of Australia's most valuable migrants. You know, they work hard, they pay a higher rate of a higher proportion of tax relative to many others in the Australian workforce because of the contribution that they're making to the Australian economy. So I think it's only right that they get access to the rights that should come with the significant contribution that they're making.
It is today, I guess, just a really blimmin' good day.
I think it's a blooming good day for Kiwis who are living in Australia, who in many cases have been living with that uncertainty for a long period of time.
Can you outline what some of the differences are? Because all of the statements up until now say it's almost the same. So what isn't the same in terms of the reciprocal relationship?
I think this arrangement now pretty much brings them into line. There might be some slight differences in terms of the fee you might pay or the exact timeframes, but by and large they're now the same.
Do you think people have been disadvantaged this way for so many years should get some sort of apology?
Look, I welcome the significant change that the Australian government has made. I think it's a very significant step forward in our relationship, in the relationship between the two countries. I want to celebrate that today and acknowledge the leadership of the current Australian government for making it a reality.
Just how generous Australia has been, because advocacy groups like Oz Kiwi were sort of hoping for tweaks or a bit more of a step, but they've given everything.
Yeah, look, I think it is a significant advance in the relationship between New Zealand and Australia. It's a very significant day for Kiwis who are living in Australia, many of whom have lived there for quite some time now, a decade or more, who have been living with this sort of temporary permanent status hanging over them. I think that it is great news for New Zealanders living in Australia.
It has been 22 years since the changes on the In your opinion, who deserves the credit for getting us to this point?
Look, I think the current Australian government really have taken this on board, and we really thank them for that. It was a commitment they made not long after taking office that they would look to deal with some of the historic injustice here. I think they have absolutely fulfilled that commitment.
Just to confirm some of the details, I mean, this applies to all New Zealanders going forward. Are there any exceptions, any fish hooks? Could, for instance, retirees for travel to Australia after 4 years get the pension over there?
So, I mean, to be clear, I'm not making the announcement on Australia's behalf. All of the detail of this will be available on the relevant Australian government website. So if you're a New Zealander living in Australia and you want to know whether it applies to you or not, the best thing to do is to actually check that with the relevant Australian authorities. I don't want to answer detailed questions on that, which are more appropriately answered on the Australian side.
There's nothing in there that has any cause for concern for you, though?
No, I think it's a very welcome set of announcements.
What impact? New Zealand Prime Ministers have called for this. Is this a case of as simple as the political will of the current Australian government?
Certainly the political will of the current Australian government has helped to make that a reality, and I acknowledge that and I absolutely thank them for it and I welcome it.
Is there some concern at all that this could be reversed kind of with a different government?
Look, ultimately that's a matter for Australia, but I certainly welcome the announcement that they've made today.
And on the children who were born in Australia, sort of how significant is that decision in including children who were born there?
Oh, I think it's very significant. I think, to all intents and purposes, they'll be Aussies. You know, they will have been born there. They'll know no other country than that. And so I think the fact that that's being acknowledged and recognised is really important. And
a super important question, but what are we going to call Kiwis and Australians with dual citizenships? Do you have a preference? Is it Kiwazis, Aussiewis?
I haven't really thought that far ahead, to be frank. But look, they'll continue to be able to be dual citizens, and actually babies born in Australia to New Zealand parents will still be able to claim New Zealand citizenship as well. So they will also be able to be dual citizens. So I think it's a sign that, you know, these people will continue to have a foot on both in both countries, and they'll be welcome in both.
This week in terms of 501s and some of those reductions that have basically kicked in from about July last year when Ardern and Albanese first met about the issue and that indication was made about a policy change. Are you comfortable with where the numbers are now sitting around that sort of fewer than 20 mark? That's about as good as it's going to get, or would you still like to see some improvements there?
It's still early days, I think, but the New Zealand government has always acknowledged the right of the Australian government to deport people who have broken the law in Australia. We have that right as a country as well. The challenge that New Zealand has always, or the issue that New Zealand has always contested, is the deportation of people who have no real link to New Zealand because they moved to Australia when they were babies, for example, and they don't have an ongoing relationship with New Zealand. They don't know anybody here, and we felt that the deportation of them was unfair and unjust. I think the change that the Australian government has made to that policy this year recognises that. It does take into account in deportation decisions the relationship that a potential deportee has with New Zealand, or with the country that they are being deported to, and I think that has made a difference.
Well, these news.
I mean, is this an issue, because this is an issue that's been raised constantly, is it one that you still need to bring to the table, i.e. this weekend, or are you confident now that the changes that have been made are kind of the limitation, I guess, of what Australia can do from its end?
Well, as I've indicated, I think that one of the sore points for New Zealand was the deportation of people that have no meaningful relationship with New Zealand. So far, indications are that the change in policy approach by Australia has dealt with that issue, but it's still early days.
Well, this new citizenship law.
The term for Australians who come to New Zealand and want New Zealand's citizenship is 5 years. It's now 4 years across the ditch. Will you drop that 5 years to 4 years here?
It's not something that we've looked at this point.
Just
to be clear, this wasn't a negotiation between New Zealand and Australia. We made our views clear to Australia. These were their decisions. Obviously, over time, we'll consider any discrepancies that might exist on our side of the equation. But these were Australia's decisions, and we certainly welcome them.
But there's no cost reciprocation.
As I've indicated, I wouldn't rule out making a change in the future, but it's not something we've looked at yet.
Prime Minister, there are growing calls for Meng Foon to lose his position. Does the government still have confidence in his political nous and his judgment?
I think decisions around, the making of political donations are matters that people need to exercise their own judgments on, and where they hold a public position, that's something that they need to think carefully about. People holding public sector roles have made donations to political parties in the past. That's not a new thing. My understanding from his public comments yesterday was that Meng Foon has a family tradition of donating to political parties across the spectrum. Ultimately, that's a question for him. In terms of his role as a Human Rights Commissioner, I don't believe that he has, in his actions in that role, demonstrated any political favour to any party. He's been very critical of some of the things that the current government has done, and so any donations he's made in the past, I don't think have in any way affected his ability to perform the duties that he has.
Was it a wise judgment then?
Ultimately, other people can form judgments on that.
I'm asking you, though, as Prime Minister.
As I indicated yesterday, I think it's important that people who hold those kind of advocacy roles make sure that they can continue to demonstrate that they are doing those in an apolitical nature, and decisions around whether they make political donations and so on are ultimately matters for them. Political donations are received by political parties across the spectrum. I would say, I think New Zealand doesn't have a political donation culture in the way other countries do. Our political donations are pretty transparent, and there aren't that many of them. I don't think that making donations to political parties should solely be the preserve of multimillionaires, and people in public sector roles don't have their rights as citizens taken away from them, but they need to act in a way that preserves the impartiality of the jobs that they do.
Doesn't it go to the basics of politics, though? If you are asked to fill a role that is politically neutral, doesn't it beg his belief donating, giving money, be it small or large donations to a political party, is not being politically neutral?
Well, you're still allowed to vote. You're still allowed to have an opinion. The question is whether or not that has an impact on the job that you do. I've seen no evidence in Meng Foon's case that it has.
Do you find apolitical as equally political or not political at all?
Apolitical means that you can do your job without fear or favour for a political party or a political cause. And I believe that people in the public service are entitled to vote. They're entitled to have a say on who the government might be. They're entitled to provide a donation to a political party if they want to. The question, in the case of the public service, for example, is whether or not they can serve the government of the day without fear or favour, regardless of who that government is. And I've seen no evidence to suggest that people who are politically aligned in their private lives are bringing that to their work. I have worked with people in the public service who have gone on to become National Party candidates and National Party MPs. I was never under any illusion as to where their personal politics lay, but they still served the government of the day very robustly and with integrity. New Zealand is a small country. We will have people like that. I've seen people move the other way, out of politics and into more neutral public sector roles. I work on a regular basis with former national MPs who hold senior public service roles. They might be on the boards of organisations and so on. And I've never had any reason to question their ability to do that impartially. I'm under no illusions that their values and their politics would still be on the other side of the spectrum.
Prime Minister, on the 501s issue, will the citizenship changes help address that in the long term?
Well, obviously, it's a positive development in that regard. It means that those people who are primarily Australian and have lived in Australia for most of their life will be able to have that recognised.
So it's essentially a long-term solution to that 501s?
It certainly will help.
And sorry, can I just ask on, because in 2001 when the Social Security Act was changed in Australia, took away the rights of Kiwis over in Australia, it was done because of mounting welfare costs. Were there any discussions with Australia about that with these changes?
Well, ultimately, these changes will make a significant difference in that New Zealanders who have been living in Australia for 4 years or more will be able to access all of those entitlements that come with citizenship. And so I think it does deal with a lot of that issue.
Yeah, but there aren't any strings that New Zealand is going to pay for Kiwis living in Australian welfare, like it was pre-2001.
As I've indicated, these were decisions that were made by the Australian government. It wasn't a negotiation. There wasn't a give and take in this. These were decisions made by the Australians.
Just following on from Michael's question about deportations, I mean, that's been the number one issue. Citizenship's probably been number two. You've cleared them off now, largely, in terms of deportation. So what's next with the relationship? Do you have other issues that you want to make strong representations on, or what's the future of the Trans-Tasman relationship?
Well, clearly we're in the 40th year of our closer economic relationship arrangements, the 50th year of Trans-Tasman travel arrangements, and the 80th year of formal diplomatic relationships between the two countries. Australia is our closest international partner in almost every regard. And I think it will continue to be. And it's our biggest economic partner, one of our biggest export markets, certainly a big market for New Zealand in terms of tourism, and the potential for us to continue to deepen that economic relationship, I think, is going to be the subject of ongoing work. It's part of what my trip to Australia this weekend is about, that opportunity to continue to further the economic partnership between our two countries. So I think that will clearly be a focus for us.
Is there anything specific in that area?
I think at this point our visit to Brisbane is an opportunity for business-to-business networking and relationships. We have a significant Māori contingent coming on the trip. There's a real opportunity for the Māori economy to be doing more in the Trans-Tasman relationship, and I think this trip is an opportunity for us to sow some seeds that can deliver in the future for us.
There's no need for like a sort of an updated CER or anything like that. There's no room for that.
We continue to explore with Australia how we can improve the economic relationship. The 40th anniversary is a good opportunity for us to take stock and say, okay, where's this economic partnership going and what are the opportunities to continue to strengthen it? I really believe that CER is a mutually beneficial arrangement for both countries. Australians get a lot out of their close economic partnership with New Zealand as we get out of our close economic partnership.
I'm not sure if this is a question for you or for Chrissy, but what was it just about the change in Australian government that has made this across the line, or was it the people who were there in those positions? What was sort of the turning point?
You're kind of asking me to provide a commentary on Australia's internal political machinations, which I don't think it would be appropriate for me to do that. Ultimately, I believe that this is a very positive and welcome development. I acknowledge the commitment made by the incoming Australian government last year to do this. I think they've absolutely delivered on the commitment that they made, regardless of all of the history behind it. I absolutely welcome the leadership that they've shown on the matter.
But have you only started negotiating or thinking that this, well, not negotiating, have you only started thinking that this would be a possibility since Anthony Albanese has been Prime Minister? Is that...
Look, I think it would be fair to say that New Zealand Prime Ministers across a range of different governments have been raising this with their trans-Tasman counterparts over the 20 or so years in question. It's fair to say that we've had a much more open door to these conversations over the last year.
Considering how long we've advocated for the move, did it come as a form of surprise that they moved so strongly and kind of so vastly?
Look, it's a very welcome set of announcements.
But personally, for you,
your face says you're surprised.
No, look, I'm very heartened. I think it is. I think it's an appropriate recognition of the fact that New Zealanders living in Australia contribute a lot to Australian economy, the Australian society, and they have been treated differently from others, and that has been unfair. And I think the Australian government have now remedied that, and I think that's a very welcome thing.
Now that irritant is going in our relationship, and it has been a big irritant, successive prime ministers have had to beat up their counterparts publicly for quite a long time. It's all of them. But what do you have a sense of? What are some kind of big initiatives in the relationship now that we don't have that irritant that you can actually get together and look at? And do you have a vision for perhaps a single step you would like to see happen over a period of time?
Look, obviously, the clearing of this particular obstacle opens the door for Prime Minister Albanese and I to discuss a range of other issues when we're meeting in Australia tomorrow. Clearly, we have a number of interests in common. Our economic interests are very much intertwined. The economic pressures that we're facing on both sides of the Tasman are obviously going to be subjects of political dialogue in terms of how our respective countries are grappling with those things. We have shared interests in the Pacific. And we work closely on Pacific matters, and I imagine that that's a relationship that's going to continue to strengthen and deepen over time.
With security?
The security relationship with Australia, obviously, the AUKUS arrangements are a topic of conversation between us. I'm sure it will come up tomorrow. That's not the driving force behind my visit to Australia this time, but I'm sure we will end up discussing that. New Zealand's position on nuclear free hasn't changed. But in terms of our collaboration with Australia, with the UK, with the US, and with our other mutual partner, Canada, is an important one for us. Those are very important relationships for us in terms of our security. And so we'll continue to work to strengthen those relationships.
The latest we had from Andrew Little was that the government was looking at whether it was a possibility to join the second tranche of AUKUS. Have you got an update on that? Is it a possibility?
So at this point, very early kind of conversations about that. So nothing formal at this point, but we haven't taken that off the table. So just very early conversations at this stage.
And on the Maori leadership that you're bringing, and you do have 4 stellar leaders all over there now, but what role do you see them playing? And I put that also in the environment where Australia is going through the voice development as well.
I'm obviously very cautious about not wanting to comment on what's happening in Australia. That's a matter for Australia. But I do see that there is real potential for strengthening the relationship between our 2 respective Indigenous peoples. And I think this strips an opportunity again for further progress in that area. The Māori economy in New Zealand is growing, it's strengthening. Australia being one of our closest trading partners, clearly this trip provides an opportunity for us to continue to grow and strengthen that relationship too.
How much do you think the 2 governments of Australia and New Zealand being centre-left parties has sort of helped with this friendship and this decision?
I'm always mindful with questions like this that you run the risk of getting into a political kind of conversation that wouldn't really be appropriate in these kind of diplomatic settings. But clearly, as I indicated before, I think it's felt like over the last just under a year now we've been knocking on an open door, and I think that has absolutely made a difference.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel to stay up to date with all the latest news from the New Zealand Herald. Click the subscribe button below or check out one of the videos here, and head over to nzherald.co.nz for more details on these stories and more.